Hey there, good morning. I'm Connie Fuksa with Foote Title Group, where we make sure that your home closing process is simple and smooth and fun, and we protect your home ownership. Welcome to Coffee with Connie. Thank you so much for being here this morning. So as I do a lot, I get questions from people and I love it. So please ask me questions, message me, let me know what you're thinking or what resonates with you when we talk about stuff. And so this morning I wanted to talk to you about something someone asked me this weekend because they watch Coffee with Connie, and they had a question because they had a situation come up in their family that actually happens to a lot of people. So one of the reasons that I love it when you guys ask questions, because that means there's probably someone else out there that has a similar question that needs help. So this morning we're going to talk about elderly parents wanting to add some of their children to the ownership of their property, but they don't know the right way to do it. And you know, honestly, what happens is our parents are elderly and they don't want to give up their house, but they want to make sure that we have it when they pass. And they want to make sure that's all buttoned up. And you know, one thing I'm going to caution you about initially is we all think that we'll take care of it eventually. Well, thinking about taking care of it eventually, maybe tomorrow something happens that isn't what was anticipated. And so that tomorrow, you didn't take care of it before that tomorrow happened. And now you've got to go through something a lot more complicated to take care of it. So thank you guys so much for your time and tuning in. And if you have a minute, check in and say hi. I appreciate it very much. So let's talk about this whole thing with your parents. So in this particular scenario, a good friend, his mom owns a piece of property and actually owned a couple pieces of property, and there's more than one child, and one of the children, she actually deeded a piece of property that didn't have a home on it. But the other child, she wanted to give the piece of property that had a home on it that she actually lives in. She wants to make sure that her other child gets that home or that piece of property. But she's elderly and she feels as though if I do the deed and I give him my piece of property, what happens if he gets mad at me and he kicks me out? Well, you know, that's not going to happen. But when you have an elderly person that has the security, they've lived in their house forever, it's their house, and they want to make sure that their property is taken care of if something happens to them, but they don't want to give up their rights. You know, it's sort of like an elderly person having to give up their driver's license. It's a very independent thing, and if they're giving up that right, then all of a sudden they've lost a lot of that independence. Hey there, Miss Carla, good morning. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, Tony McClure, how are you today? So we're talking about this property, and this friend says to me, well, my mom really wants me to have that property if something happens to her, but she's scared and she doesn't want me to take that property away from her. She doesn't want to give it to me now and then have something happen and she doesn't have control because it's not her home anymore. So we talked about a couple different options for that. So one is to add that child to that piece of property, and then then we can talk about ownership interests. So in that scenario, there's a couple of different things that can be done, but more than likely what they'd want to do is put that person on the ownership. So now you have a parent, a father and mother adding their child, and they want to add that child, and so that ownership interest could be two different ways. One's called joint tenants and the other's called tenants in common. Joint tenants means all three of them own 100% of that piece of property. So if something happens to one of them, the surviving two people in that scenario would own that piece of property 100%. So that way, if something happens to the child before it happens to the parents, then the parents still retain ownership of that property. If something happens to the child and one of the parents, then the surviving parent automatically owns 100% of that property. So joint tenants is a comfortable way to do that, where nothing has to be done if a circumstance happens. The other is called tenants in common, where everybody owns a divided interest in that property. And where that could happen in this scenario is, let's say, for example, the husband and wife, the parents, were a couple that was married later in life, and the child they want to add to the property is the mother's child, but not the father's. And the father wants to make sure his interest goes to the children in his life that he had before this marriage. And so they could do tenants in common because each person owns a divided interest. So if something happens to the mother, then her interest goes into her estate, which would mean all of her kids would own it with the child that is on the property. Then if something happened to that child, then anyone in his estate, his family, children, parent, spouse, would have an ownership interest in that property. So that's a little more complicated way to do it, but certainly a way to address maybe some concerns about different others that wouldn't be involved. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out, and this is what my friend and I had a discussion about, was that you can do what's called a life estate. So if this person is elderly and you want to make sure that they still retain all of that ownership interest, and that all you're doing is going on that title of that property when something happens without having to go through a will and estate process, you can create what's called a life estate. And so what happens is within the body of that deed, there is language that discusses the right of the people that live there, those original owners, that they retain full ownership for their life. And so when their life is over, then it automatically transfers to the person that has the remainder interest. So you have what's called a life estate in there, and then you have what's called a remainder man, which means the person that remains after the person passes away. So the life estate gives those owners complete and total interest in that property for as long as their life for as long as they're alive. And then as soon as they pass, their interest goes to that remainder person. So that's another way we can do that deed. And they're very simple to create, and everyone just needs to sign. Everyone who's in the ownership chain now has to sign it. So in this case, 2 parents would need to sign it. The person being added does not need to sign it now because they don't have an ownership interest. And we prepare that deed, get that ownership interest set up the way they want, and then we get it recorded in the land records. Excuse me. And so that way that ownership is now recognized. So definitely have these conversations with people that you love, whether you have a spouse who's ill, whether you have a spouse you haven't added to the ownership of a property and you keep meaning to, whether your parents are doing some estate planning purposes. Let's talk this through with them. I can help you have those conversations. Anybody on my team can help you with that. And we want to make sure that the interests are addressed the way you want them, because things can happen tomorrow. They can happen today. And you want to make sure that your ownership interests are addressed and protected the way that you want them to. There's lots of different options to take care of it, and I can help you have those conversations with those elderly parents that maybe don't understand these things. So hope that gave you a little tidbit, and if you have some more questions, message me or anyone on our team. You can find anyone on our team in Maryland or Virginia, www.footetitlegroup.com. There's also lots of resources on those pages. There's a buyer's page, seller's page, and realtor's lender's page that has a resource tab and helpful links that can help you answer lots of these different kinds of questions. So hopefully I helped you with a little bit of information today. If you found the information helpful, please click the share button and share it with those people that you know. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this morning. I'm Connie Fuksa. This has been Coffee with Connie. I own Foote Title Group, where we protect your home ownership. Have a great day, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.